Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. The inflation figures are out, and for now at least, the silent thief is here to stay. And it's all because of the bureaucratic groupthink of the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, as well as the rustiness of its governor, Andrew Bailey. The ostriches need to take their heads out of the sand. The Labour Party is drawing up plans to pack the House of Lords with Labour peers, despite recently having flirted with the idea of abolishing the Lords altogether. But ultimately, it's the peers themselves who are to blame for this increasingly meddlesome approach they take to the pledges of elected governments, especially since Brexit. The British Army was once the envy of the world, but is it now just a shell of its former self? NATO's number 2 seems to think so, as the number of serving troops continues to decline. And the COVID inquiry has heard from a former medical officer that lockdown has damaged a generation. We'll be hearing from a speech and language expert about the disastrous consequences of lockdown on our children. But some good news. The National Portrait Gallery has triumphantly reopened, and it may have just found the antidote to woke. I'm looking forward to seeing it for myself. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by a fiery panel this evening, former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and journalist and author Matthew Stadlen. As ever, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now it's time for the news with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you. Good evening. Well, the news tonight is that the US Coast Guard says it's expanding the search area where perceived SOS signals were detected as they race to locate a missing tourist submersible visiting the Titanic shipwreck. At a news conference this evening, we heard that 5 surface assets and 2 remotely operated vehicles are currently deployed in the area in the North Atlantic. Officials did say, however, they don't really know what the detected sound signals might be or if they even originated from the Titan, that's the name of the submersible. Audiologists from the US Navy are analysing those recordings. So 5 people then are inside that craft right now. They may have as little as 20 hours of oxygen left, and we understand they have limited food rations on board. Captain Jamie Frederick from the US Coast Guard said a couple of hours ago they have to remain optimistic.
The surface search is now approximately 2 times the size of Connecticut, and the subsurface search is up to 2.5 miles deep, exponentially expanding the size of the search area. We also have to factor in the ever-changing weather conditions, currents, and sea states that expand the search area every hour. There is an enormous complexity associated with this case due to the location being so far offshore, and the coordination between multiple agencies and nations.
Well, here at home, a man has been arrested following what one eyewitness described as a mad rampage with a pickaxe at Central Middlesex Hospital in West London. 2 people sustained injuries, with 1 left in a life-threatening condition. The suspect has been admitted to hospital. They have severe injuries being described as self-inflicted. Armed police were deployed to the scene, but the incident wasn't being treated as terror-related. Gareth Brown saw the attacker chase 2 men.
We just see him come running out the side of the building with a pickaxe in his hand, chasing two people, which we thought were 2 lads that done something incriminating inside the hospital. Hence, that's why he was chasing them. So that's where we have approached him to make sure he was okay. But that time he's coming towards us, swinging his axe, and he's just told us it's none of our business, get out of our way.
Economic news, and the UK's inflation rate stayed the same despite expectations there may be a fall. The Office for National Statistics released its figures showing inflation stayed at 8.7% up until May. That's the same rate as during April. And that comes as the UK's net debt reached £2.6 trillion at the end of May, and the average UK house price increased by 3.5% in the 12 months to April. Well, the government has set out a major package of financial support for Ukraine to bolster the country's economic stability as it continues to push back against Russian forces. The package includes a £20 million boost to ensure companies working within Ukraine. The funding, which includes £2.35 billion of World Bank loan guarantees, will support the restoration of vital public services. That includes running schools and hospitals. The Prime Minister says Russia must pay for the destruction it's inflicted as a result of the war. That's the news. You're up to date on TV, online, DAB+ radio and the TuneIn app. This is GB News. Back now to Jacob.
The inflation figures for the month of May were revealed today, and the headline figure remains exactly the same as last month at 8.7%. The Bank of England Governor and Chief Ostrich, Andrew Bailey, points to three key factors in his analysis of the situation: the COVID lockdowns and all the supply chain disruption that followed, the war in Ukraine and all its effects on supplies and commodities, and obviously energy, and unusually low unemployment, which perhaps counterintuitively can propel inflation by forcing companies to pay higher wages. But the United States has the same problems. We came out of lockdown at a similar time to them. They too suffer the effects of the war in Ukraine, and they have similar unemployment levels to us. And yet, US inflation sits at 4.05%, less than half of ours. The problem really lies with the fact that the Bank of England was much too slow to raise interest rates in the period after the 2008 financial crash. After that crash, Western nations took their rates nearly to zero. But in 2016, the Federal Reserve began slowly bringing their rates back up again to more sensible levels, to about 2.5% by 2019, before bringing them back down again for the pandemic. Meanwhile, in the UK, we kept rates below 1% from 2008 until May of last year. We did not follow the Federal Reserve's lead, and now we're suffering the consequences of keeping interest rates unrealistic low for too long. Not to mention the vast amounts of quantitative easing conducted latterly superfluously by the bank at the end of the pandemic. When the Bank of England first became independent, the wise men of the Monetary Policy Committee were selected for their eclecticism. They thought differently. They brought various schools of thought to the table. But now the bank and the Monetary Policy Committee is dominated by bureaucratic groupthink. They all think the same. They all follow the governor's lead. They're all driven by Treasury, bank, OBR orthodoxy. What we need is more diversity in the bank. And I don't mean woke diversity. I mean diversity of thought that will challenge groupthink. But above all, what we need from the government to help with this are the supply side reforms that may ease the problem, may help bring prices down. It's now time the ostriches of the Bank of England removed their heads from the sand, stopped flapping about, and began to realise how serious the problem is. But of course, I want to know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. Joining me now is the highly respected GB News economics and business editor, Liam Halligan. Liam, the Bank of England, once again, is blaming everybody else other than itself. How much blame is it fair to put on the Bank of England?
Well, I think you're right to show us some history, Jacob. The Bank of England kept interest rates ultra low after 2010. That was largely under the watch of Mark Carney. I agree that they should have followed the Fed and tried to get out of the habit of low interest rates. But of course, financial markets loved low interest rates. Governments liked low interest rates. It meant they could borrow. And alongside low interest rates, you also had hundreds of billions of pounds of funny money, all that quantitative easing. Again, that was justified after the global financial crisis, but the emergency medicine became a lifestyle choice. Crack cocaine economic policy. Governments were addicted to it. Financial markets were addicted to it. And then on top of that, aside from the reasons that the governor gives, he never talks about quantitative easing. Members of the Monetary Policy Committee never talk about quantitative easing. That is their groupthink. There are no monetarists. And let's be clear, Jacob, pre-COVID, quantitative easing was about £425 billion over 10 years. A lot of that money stayed within the financial system. It jacked up stock and bond prices. It jacked up the prices of rich houses in certain London suburbs where bankers lived. Post-COVID QE, completely different. We did more quantitative easing. The Bank of England created more money in the year and a half of lockdown than it did in the previous 10 years. And that post-COVID QE, and for me, this is the key analytical breakthrough, which the bank won't accept, that post-COVID QE, it didn't stay in the financial system. It was paid directly into the bank accounts of firms and households in the form of furlough and those business recovery loans. And that's why it's inflationary. And that, above all, is what explains this rising core inflation that's driving the headline inflation number.
And that's really important. And I know Tim Congdon, one of the most respected monetarist economists, absolutely shares that view that the last round of QE is the most responsible. And you're saying that that went out into the real economy, whereas the first lot just ensured banks' balance sheets were sustainable and we didn't lose.
It was an
most of the
asset
banking
swap
system.
between banks and investors and the central bank, to coin a phrase.
And therefore, you've now got headline inflation. Absolutely fair to say that's affected by energy prices and food prices and trace that back to Ukraine and supply side issues. But core inflation is different, isn't it? And that's what you're saying comes from the final round of quantitative easing, the pandemic quantitative easing that got into the financial system and therefore has propped up prices falsely. And until that's drained off, prices will remain high. Exactly
right, Jacob. That's well put. And you won't hear this conversation anywhere on mainstream television or radio except on GB News. And it's good that the likes of you and me are drilling down into this, because this is what people need to understand. So you had all that quantitative easing during the COVID era, and it did go directly into the bank accounts of firms and households, so it did get into circulation, and that drove up inflation. And as for energy prices, wholesale gas prices in Europe are now a tenth of what they were compared to their post-Putin's invasion peak. Oil prices are 30% down on this time last year. This is not driving inflation. It's our inefficient energy markets that are driving inflation, converting those wholesale prices into retail prices for firms and households. That's a problem, and that's a supply side thing. But above all, for me, a bit of wage bargaining at the edges, but this core inflation, which went up today from 6.8% in April to 7.1% in May, that is a monetary phenomenon, and no one on the Bank of England, none of the MPC members on the Bank of England really understand or even respect monetary economics.
But what's so odd about this is that this is one of the ABC rules of economics, that when governments, which they've been tempted to do, you can go back to the Roman Empire in these contexts, when governments have been tempted to clip the currency, to create extra money and put it in people's pockets, to pretend that money has a value that it doesn't have, you get inflation. That inflation is a monetary phenomenon always and everywhere. And the only people denying this are the Bank of England. Everyone else knows this, surely.
The Nobel laureate Milton Friedman said exactly that, as you just quoted. Even John Maynard Keynes, he once told Franklin D. Roosevelt, trying to engender growth by printing money is like trying to get fat by wearing a bigger belt. It doesn't work. If this stuff created genuine prosperity, Zimbabwe would be in the G7. Throughout history, it's basic economic common sense that you can't just create money in order to engender wealth. In the immediate aftermath of the banking crisis in 2007, 2008, Mervyn King, and I agreed with him then, and the Monetary Policy Committee introduced quantitative easing. But after 2010, 2011, it was no longer justified, and yet it continued because it was convenient for financial and political interests.
And this is the real problem, that it goes back with the Bank of England to the previous governor. It's not just Andrew Bailey, it's Carney as well, who kept on saying he was going to reduce quantitative easing and normalise interest rates, and never did. And therefore you left this overhang of money, which inevitably seeps out from the financial sector. Then you increase it with COVID, and then you get inflation, inevitably.
Andrew Bailey isn't an economist. He's an economic historian, and I'd expect an economic historian to understand what we're talking about. But this goes back to the problem you identified in your monologue, if I may say so. You're completely right. When Gordon Brown and New Labour made the Bank of England independent, and I think they should be congratulated for that, I don't want to unpick Bank of England independence. They chose a Monetary Policy Committee that was full of heterodox thinkers, people of different views, massive intellect and reputation, but they were out-of-the-box thinkers, there were monetarists on the committee. They weren't just all Treasury placemen and women, Whitehall time servers as they currently are now. We desperately need that proper diversity of opinion on the MPC, and yet the appointments on the MPC are now dominated by the Treasury, and that's why my kind of headline when it comes to this policy dilemma, the problem isn't that the Bank of England's independent, the problem is it isn't independent enough, because you haven't got enough people on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee who are prepared to push back against the conventional wisdom.
And the MPC almost always ends up following the governor's lead, and so it becomes the sort of epitome of groupthink. Liam, thank you so much. Don't forget to let me know what you think, mailmog@gbnews.uk. Coming up, a certain former editor of The Sun has a thing or two to say about the state of the nation, particularly in relation to inflation. And don't forget, as the COVID inquiry continues, what effect did it have on your, and indeed my, children?
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute. Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at Drive Time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christie's, on GB News and GB News Radio.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Peter, how long will it take for the Bank of England to realise that increasing interest rates puts up prices and so puts up inflation? The economic theory that increasing bank rate reduces inflation is clearly being proved to be very wrong. Jake, the impact Brexit has had is huge. This, I think, is probably a pseudonym for Mark Carney, both in terms of wage increases for those whose skills are in short supply and food price increases. Nothing to do with food price increases. Never mind. Brexit has been a disaster for the UK. Oh, well, we'll celebrate the anniversary tomorrow, and the day after. Mick, the Bank of England has been failing for a long time. The The question is, why has nothing been done by government to rectify this? The last governor was useless, and the present one is worse. Sack him and appoint Martin Lewis. It was the brutal winter of 1978 when a Labour government led by James Callaghan governed a Britain shaken by the trade unions, rampant inflation and general political turmoil. That very winter prompted the infamous headline by the then editor of The Sun, Larry Lamb, The Winter of Discontent. Incidentally, the winter of discontent was made glorious summer by this son of York, so perhaps Sunak will be the son of York. But as we've had a tumultuous year of strikes, inflation and some might say some political disarray, do we find ourselves in a similar situation to those years of the late 1970s? Well, who better to have with me than Larry Lamb's successor, Mr. Kelvin Mackenzie, along with author and journalist Matthew Stadlen. Kelvin, I'd better come to you first. Is this a summer of discontent? Is it reminiscent of 1978, 1979?
Not really, no. I mean, I obviously lived through that period, and that was an absolute nightmare. However, the difference this time is this was a Labour government that got it all wrong in the 70s. This one is a Conservative government. And honestly, Jacob, you are one of those that are responsible for this. You sat there in a cabinet while, honestly, we had a Prime Minister who decided to give money away. Remember, he was a former editor of The Spectator. He couldn't tell a balance sheet from a roll of cheese, right? And he just gave billions away. Billions that wasn't matched by production. You said, oh, you sit at home, take money, take 80% of your thing. Then after that, every shopkeeper in the country can come up with some kind of turnover which said you're entitled to 50,000 quid, right? We didn't produce anything at all. Nothing happened. What did you do about it? Did you feel so angry that you resigned from the government?
No,
Did you feel angry enough to actually quit the Conservative Party?
I thought that when we locked down, we couldn't bankrupt people when the government had ordered them to lock down. That if the government orders a lockdown, which certainly the first one I thought was right, you have to compensate people.
Jacob, good to be on your show. Thank you
for coming.
It's also important to point out, I'm afraid, and I thought I was going to be taking on both of you this evening, but it seems that for the moment we're both taking you on because you're also Business Secretary during one of the most disastrous administrations in British history. That's the Liz Truss government, which lasted barely more than a month. And you were sitting there as a member of the Cabinet, collective responsibility, as Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng destroyed the British economy. Now, you can point to Ukraine, of course you can, and the tragedy of what's going on there. You can point, of course, to the pandemic. Let's leave Brexit out of it for the moment. But you have to take some responsibility for where we are now yourself.
Well, of course, anyone who's been in government has to take some responsibility. But actually, the real issue last September was once again the Bank of England failing to increase interest rates at that point. You had the Federal Reserve going faster than the Bank of England. The Bank of England didn't do it. Yep. The currency collapsed. This did coincide with Kwasi's minute budget,
there are things,
but it was the bank that was
There are things
failing.
essentially wrong with our country, right? Working from home is a disaster. We have no productivity, right? Even Greece, by the way.
And I did try and stop that, if you'll give me a little bit of credit.
Yes, OK, I'll give you some credit. Right, so working from home is a disaster. People are doing less, our productivity is going down. At a moment we need to go up. If we want to pay any of our debts off, we have to work harder. We are idle, we are over-unionised, and nobody is prepared. And your government is a very... I know this is... Matthew will probably think this is amazing. This is a very, very liberal government. You've got a problem, here's a cheque. You've got a problem, here's a cheque. Our benefit payments, as you know, that 10%, have gone through the roof and was blamed. One of the things that was blamed, which is about the only thing I really agree with one of the reasons, was the reason why inflation stayed the same. So we are paying out money we do not possess. And this is a crisis which isn't going to end, as Rishi says, at the end of this year. Be right through to the election. Honestly, Jacob, you are done for. You will lose your seat in all this.
Jacob, it's very important to point out, because you rightly brought up the winter of discontent. I don't think we're quite where we were then. I was born at the end of 1979, so for the first 18 years of my life, it was a Tory government.
You lived in that golden age, the first 18 years of
Why
your
was
life.
there a Tory government? At least in the early years, there was a Tory government precisely because of the winter of discontent. When inflation is rampant, when people are suffering not just because of the cost of living, but because of corrective measures to try to bring down inflation, which then hits them doubly if they have a mortgage. Who are they going... Let me just quickly finish the point. Who are they going to blame, Jacob? You're being attacked on the right. You're being criticised on the left. You remember the phrase, as a historian of British politics, it's the economy stupid. Fast forward to the next general election, whenever we are granted one, and I predict that the Tories are going to get a hammering, because people, this is the last point, people will ask themselves, was I better off in 2019 or even 2010 than I am now? And they'll probably say, most of your viewers will probably say yes. Under those circumstances, how can they vote for your party?
That's a different issue, really. I think the consequences of economic policy are profound politically, but it's trying to work out what the causes are. And you mentioned Liz Truss, and I think, although it was handled badly, although things went wrong, but idiotic of me to pretend otherwise, actually what she was going for, economic growth and supply-side reforms, a healthier economy with deregulation, was the one way of helping with the inflation.
We aren't producing... But Brexit, I agree with the chap on one of your mailbox, right, who described Brexit as a disaster. You must accept, even a year into it, and by the way, we're now 7 years since we voted for it, that had we known that this was going to happen, right, there would not have been a majority.
I don't believe that at all. I don't believe that at all. That we
well, give me one example of how it's worked for the economy. Let's talk
we've
about
saved
the economy.
£191 billion, £191 billion by not being part of the EU's
What, do you mean? Do you mean the annual payment? You mean?
No, £191 billion of extra payment that the EU has taken on because of its COVID recovery plan of €2 trillion.
Jacob, I'll say one thing in your favour. I'll say one thing in your favour, and that is that exports, global exports, British global exports, seem to be at a record high. Now, the question, of course, is, would they have been at a record high had we not Brexited? But let me just put this question to you, because I think it's a valid one. You won that referendum because you had a coalition. You had Boris Johnson, you had some on the left, you had Jeremy Corbyn dragging his feet, but you also had another very key participant, ally, and that was Nigel Farage. He has just vacated this very studio. He said a few weeks ago he is disappointed with how Brexit has gone. Where do you stand? Are you happy with where Brexit is at the moment? Because you were in charge of the effects of Brexit, Brexit.
I was in charge of the retained EU law bill, which the government gutted, which was the best way of getting the deregulation that we need to get some economic growth. We're going to have to come back. We'll probably discuss Brexit tomorrow. But thank you to my panel. Coming up, our army was once the envy of the world, but is it now a shell of its former self? NATO's number 2 seems to think so. Plus, cost of lockdown on our children specifically. We'll be hearing from a speech and language expert about the effect it had on your, and indeed my, children.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians
to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, I'm Dan Wootton. You can watch me live on GB News Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. And did you know that you can also watch and listen live on our website, gbnews.com. You'll always be up to date on the latest breaking news, as well as enjoying the best stories, opinions and shows. You can even join the debate under our live player as you're watching. So head straight to gbnews.com on TV, radio and online. GB News, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Kerr, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is 2 new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your thoughts. When I, a common man, could have done Mark Carney's job sitting at home, and I agree with you, interest rates have been too low in the past and printing money like drunken sailors. The incompetence of the past governor and present is staggering. And David, JRM, the problem with the House of Lords is that it's full of failed MPs and cronies. At least the hereditary peers didn't play party politics. So, the UK once had one of the most powerful fighting forces in the world, controlling the largest empire in history. Today, we now hear that senior army personnel are concerned over the UK's dwindling fighting power. In 2015, the government pledged to get recruitment numbers up to 82,000, but failed to do so, and now the army is to be cut to 72,000 by 2025. The concern is that with low fighting power, the UK may lose its influence in NATO. The echoed sentiment with senior army officials that an unbalanced investment in modern technologies instead of manpower leaves us in a predicament that hasn't gone unnoticed. General Sir Tim Radford was quoted by The Telegraph, "If someone comes towards you with a tank, you can't cyber it away. You can't cross a bridge with cyber. It needs to be balanced." With Russia's turnaround of 1.3 million troops, does size really matter? And should we be concerned about regaining the balance between tech and boots on the ground? Well, I'm joined now by Major General Chip Chapman. Major General, thank you for joining me. Are you concerned that 72,000, lower numbers than since the Napoleonic War, means that we just don't have enough to be an influence in NATO, let alone enough if we need to deploy troops?
Well, troop-contributing nations give you leverage and influence. And if you diminish the number that you've got, that diminishes your leverage and your influence. That's just a truism. It's also a truism that an army is always too big in war, in peace, and too small in war. It's really the capability that you can deliver, which is the key thing. And I think we've got 3 problems at the moment in the British Army. The first one is the fight tonight capability. If you were to say to the British Army, turn out the door in 48 hours, you'd have a problem. You would probably be able to get something like 1 brigade out there and the global contingency force from the airborne brigade. Now, we saw that really with the enhanced forward presence battle group in Estonia, where earlier this year, after the Ukrainian invasion, a brigade was allocated, not deployed, because we couldn't deploy a brigade with the rotations that have to come. So that's the first problem. The second problem in capability terms is we've had a number of capability holidays, and this has been acknowledged by the Assistant Chief of the General Staff in March this year when he talked about the 4+1 deficits. That was fires, artillery and rockets, drones, air defence, electronic warfare, but as crucially, the +1 was logistics, that's sustainability. We just can't sustain a force for very long in the field. The final one is this week we had the Haythornthwaite report out, a review of armed forces incentivisation. This is the crux of the matter in terms of the manpower and women power in terms of recruiting and retention. So it said that between October 21, September 22, we've had a 30% reduction in the number of people joining the regular forces, a 17% increase in outflow, and that's resulted in a deficit of 4,250 people. So there is a problem. There's a structural problem, there's a workforce problem, and there's an equipment capability problem.
Well, this is quite serious because you're saying that it's not just the government target of how many we need. We can't get those that we do because we're not recruiting. Just so that people can understand, how many are there in a brigade? So how many was it that we weren't able to deploy to Estonia?
Well, a battle group in Estonia would be something like 1,000 personnel. A brigade can be something between 3,000 and 4,000 people, depending upon what the makeup of it is, because you task organise towards the task that you have to do. But the reason we partly couldn't do that is partly because of the brigade headquarters, but partly because of the number of armoured regiments that we've got. We've only got 3 armoured regiments. They do a kind of either a 6-month or 1-year rotation in Estonia. If you need a sort of 18 months between deployments, you just can't do that with 3 regiments. And of course, if you keep deploying people endlessly, then people will vote with their feet and sign off because they just don't see their families, because they're training to go on operations, and then training again to go on operations. So the sort of football and the tempo is too big.
Thank you, Major General. That is quite a thought, that we can't even deploy 3,000 to 4,000 people in a brigade. Now, who would have thought that the Labour Party, renowned for its recent flirting, and ancient flirting actually, with the abolition of the House of Lords, would be drawing up plans to pack Westminster's upper chamber with peers, so to avoid potential conflict if Labour came to power. The chamber currently has 262 Conservatives, 183 crossbenchers, 174 Labour and 83 Lib Dems. So Labour certainly has some work to do in catching up. But I'm actually somewhat sympathetic with Sir Flip-Flop a lot, because although he may be getting a bit ahead of himself and needs to win election first, ultimately the Lords are responsible because they have been thwarting legislation from a government with a clear electoral mandate. Indeed, it emerged earlier this year that the government has lost more than half its votes in the Lords since the 2016 referendum, and it's been defeated at twice the rate in the last 6 years than it was defeated in the previous 6 years. Its defeats have more than doubled. So what else could this be but the Labour Party acknowledging a potential legislative obstacle? Well, with me on my panel, former editor of The Sun, Kelvin Mackenzie, and the journalist and author, Matthew Stadlen. Matthew, it's unusual for me to be so sympathetic to the Labour Party, but the Lords is there to say this should be a negative SI rather than on the minister's nod. It's to do the boring detail of legislation. But in fact, for the last 6 years, it hated Brexit, and it's just voted down every bit of government legislation. And with a Labour government coming in, if it were to, they'd be voting against elements of a Labour manifesto because they feel they're entitled to do so.
If we were starting from scratch as a democratic enterprise, I don't think any of us would set up the House of Lords in its current state, because it seems to me, at least on the face of it, anti-democratic. My concern about getting rid of it, and I suspect in reality Labour will not do that, my concern about it is, what do you replace it with? You have to have a very, very clear idea of what comes next, because actually you're tinkering with a democratic institution in one sense, is part of our unwritten constitution that has been here for hundreds and hundreds of years. So if you are going to do something so constitutionally massive, you have to understand properly what is going to follow it. I just say one thing about the House of Lords, and you might find an analogy here in the monarchy. People might not expect me to be a supporter of the monarchy. Again, if we were starting from scratch, we surely wouldn't create a hereditary monarchy. But actually, there is an argument that we don't want to have an elected president, and that we sort of rumble along OK with it as things stand. You might make the same argument for the House of Lords. I mean, your former cabinet colleague, Nadine Dorries, who's very upset at not being nominated for a peerage, or she was going to be, but then Rishi Sunak or whoever stood in the way, number 10 denies that. The key thing she said, and I was slightly sympathetic to what she said, was that the House of Lords does a lot of the heavy lifting. So if we are going to get rid of it, you have to make sure that an elected alternative will really work, and the people who are elected are going to work as hard as the House of Lords does at the moment.
And that's right, isn't it, Kelvin, that the House of Lords is there to do the heavy lifting. It is much better at examining statutory instruments than the House of Commons. But it's not there to do the party politics. That's the business of the democratically elected House, and the House of Lords has been overstepping the mark.
No, I know, but this has been going on for yonks. I mean, there were quite interesting stats there that it's actually getting worse. They get more uppity, but I think we just got to live with that. My main point about this really was, are there really 22 Labour apparatchiks who are good enough to become lords? I mean, because what they're saying is that you've got to be young, because they want you to do what you're making your point, which is to be in there in the morning and still there at night, rather than doing what I can remember one baroness used to do, which is pop in, sign it, grab the 300 quid and leg it, right? So are there really this huge panoply of great Labour politicians who aren't going to be MPs, but are good enough to become Lord and Lady, you know? And I doubt that. But look, honestly, the Cameron and co have been packing the House of Lords with the Conservative mob.
But they haven't, because we lose vote after vote. They should have done. I mean, I kept on saying to Boris he should appoint lots of peers, so we might win a few votes in the Lords. But
that's probably partly because of Brexit, and Brexit cut across party lines, didn't it? I think a couple of thoughts that I'd like to make. One is that...
But it's also in immigration. It's not just on Brexit that they're voting against the government.
What really upsets people, what really rankles, is the idea that people's cronies, Prime Minister's cronies, are appointed, particularly if you are being rewarded for failure. Now, you and I are very polite to each other. My belief, and you can think the same of me, Jacob, is that you have failed, that you failed as a government minister. You were rewarded for that failure by being knighted. I don't think, with all due respect, I think you're a very intelligent man, and I've always respected the fact that you will debate people, but I don't
realise we're going to get a bit of an analysis.
No, I think people don't like hang on, people do not like cronyism. That is a really important point.
All appointments to the House of Lords throughout history have been on cronyism. I mean, you go back to the kings of England, they appointed their cronies. Prime ministers from Walpole appointed
just on the
their cronies.
Keir Starmer
that
point.
has always been the case. Starmer appointed his cronies. He appointed his chief advisor.
Jacob, just on that Keir Starmer point, because this is the nub of what we're talking about. We're talking about this apparently because it's a news story. It's not a news story. Back in the autumn/winter, Starmer said on Sky News, a rival channel, that he wanted to abolish the House of Lords. He was subsequently and inevitably asked, will you therefore not be appointing peers yourself? And his answer to that was, everyone wants to see a functional House of Lords while we move towards
so it's a flip-flop. Is that fair?
It is a flip-flop, and he himself says about that point, he said, we've got important things to do. God help us, right? So they've got 3 years, he says, before he will beginning to address the House of Lords issue. The truth about the matter, as with most things, I don't blame him for this, is it'll be kicked into the long grass, and that's the last we'll hear of it.
Well, once again, reform of the House of Lords is the long grass. Bear in mind the 1911 Parliament Act says it's a temporary measure until a more democratic means of having a House of Lords can be, an upper chamber can be found. Well, here we are, 112 years on, and it's still a temporary measure. Coming up, it's the troubling cost of lockdown on our youth as the COVID inquiry hears more troubling evidence. And don't forget, has the National Portrait Gallery avoided the woke curse?
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it, like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference. And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates. Do you not believe in prisons?
I don't believe in prisons.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
You've probably seen politicians interviewed 1,000 times, but we do it differently. We find out who they really are, we don't shout, we chat, and hopefully we bring a bit of light, not just heat. Did you know Kate Moss?
Apparently.
Do you have a pair of jeans or a pair of jeans?
No, of course I don't. What would I do with them?
My friends are like, oh my God, what's she doing now?
Join me every Sunday at 6 for Gloria Meets, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Weeknights on GB News from 6 p.m. You'll always get drama.
Please stop, Michelle.
I know, yeah.
Please stop.
Should I just shut off?
Romance.
You like me, I like you. There you go.
There you are. Well, don't tell anybody.
Adventure.
Etc.
That's the whole point. But
And action.
Sergeant Reed, my superstar panel, they're already at it. They're fighting. It's going to be quite a show.
Only on GB News. Britain's watching.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Peter, Jacob, with respect, get rid of all the current peers and replace them with hereditary ones. It ran much better with the real nobility running the show, as they had the country's long-term interests at heart. Mark, strikes me there are tens of thousands of civil servants in the MOD, yet the military is in a parlous state. I know this as we have supplied the MOD and I've visited the sites. Just yesterday, the COVID inquiry heard from former Chief Medical Officer Dame Sally Davis that lockdown had damaged a generation. She explained that whilst she supported the first national lockdown, she was deeply saddened by the educational and social scarring lockdowns have caused preschoolers and young people. This comes as 1.4 million children in the UK now have long-term speech, language and communication needs. And children referred to speech and language therapists have to wait for up to 10 months for an initial appointment. This is no surprise, as toddlers during the lockdowns encountered a completely different experience to the previous generation. Infants were unable to join swimming lessons, attend family gatherings or nurseries, no doubt causing knock-on effects on their development. Speech Club is an on-demand speech and language improvement programme offering therapy to families and nurseries in 44 nations across the globe. The organisation is leading the way to solve this crisis. I'm joined now by one of their representatives, speech and language therapist, Claire Whitaker. Claire, thank you for joining me. It's quite an admission from Sally Davis, but it's very worrying about the damage that has been caused. How widespread do you think it is?
I think it's far more widespread than we initially thought. As speech therapists, we are just inundated now with calls from parents who are just saying, my child's now approaching 3 and 4 and they're not speaking. And we're aware of really the damage that lockdown and lack of socialisation has had in this generation of preschoolers who haven't got speech and who are unable to communicate effectively. So, yes,
because they weren't mixing with their peers, they weren't socialising, they weren't doing any of the things that young children normally do. Even if they're not at preschool, they weren't seeing other members of their family, their cousins, they weren't doing all those things that children do in the early years.
Exactly, and I think what's sometimes forgotten is that when a child learns to speak, they have to know all the sort of pre-verbal skills, so learning to share and to take turns and to make eye contact and look at facial expression. And if your child isn't integrated and socialised with other children, they don't have that opportunity to do that. And then even when lockdown was then lifted, we were all wearing face masks. So again, the children weren't picking up lip patterns appropriately. And the result now is this generation who are struggling at school and not talking in nurseries.
And we knew pretty early on that children weren't at any risk. And that's something I think is so important the inquiry gets to grips with, is not should we have locked down earlier, should we have done more of it, but why were we locking down children when we know the risk to them of COVID was minuscule?
I think it's always easy to look back. I think for me now the importance is the government's appreciating the importance of early intervention. If they don't act now, their money's going to be spent much later on when these children are aged 11, 12, their language delayed still at that point. There is a national crisis of lack of speech therapists. There are huge waiting times. Organisations like Speech Club that we have set up is allowing children to have immediate direct speech therapy.
And how do people get in touch with you?
Well, if they look at speechclub.com and there's a free taster sessions on there, there's access to us. There's a way of just families being able to press play at their homes today to actually watch us deliver speech therapy direct to their child. So we're hoping that will address or offer a solution.
Because you're absolutely right, that although we obviously need to understand what went wrong, actually you've got lots of children we need to help now, and you're offering a route to do that so that children who have been held back can catch up and can catch up reasonably quickly.
Yes, well, it's nice. It's been lovely to offer a solution. I think we've always been faced with, there's lack of money, there are these waiting times, there's 29% of speech therapy posts vacant at the moment. So we're able to say to local authorities, well, we do have an answer, we do have a solution. And one of the leading local authorities are running with Speech Club at the moment, which is lovely. And we're just imploring now other local authorities to recognise they can use us.
So where's your funding coming from? Is it coming from local authorities or from parents themselves?
It's a bit of everything, to be honest. I mean, the nursery, we offer nursery sessions and a nursery service, which has been really successful with lovely feedback, where the nurseries can apply for help, and then through government funding or through parental funding, they can then have subscriptions so that their whole class, their whole nursery can watch Speech Club lessons. And I think for all children, it's beneficial to actually be pointed out the importance of eye contact and how to link words together and how to socialise. And for the nursery staff, we're offering this training, because I think the other thing is these poor nursery staff are being inundated with huge numbers of children who are presenting with language delay, but they themselves haven't got the skills to know how to address this need. So Speech Club is also offering the training.
So Speech Club is educating them, is teaching the teachers so that they can then help the children who need to catch up. And that because you're doing it through programmes and so on, you can reach the numbers, which because of the shortage of speech therapists aren't getting individual support which they might otherwise be getting.
Exactly. And I think it's been exciting. It's in 44 countries now. So it is a feeling of the word is beginning to get out there that there is an alternative. There is a way of addressing this need.
Because it wasn't only the UK that locked down, countries across the world locked down, and you're finding this is true across the world, not language dependent, so you must be helping with other languages as well as English.
Well, we're actually just looking at English, but the pre-verbal
countries that speak English you're helping with, my goodness.
Because I think also that the pre-verbal skills, so if you've got a child who isn't making eye contact or isn't sharing, it's teaching, how do you teach that? And lots of people don't know that, but as speech and language therapists, it's something we're dealing with all the time. So we can offer lessons and handouts and manuals that are all accessible for families literally on their phone or on their iPad straight away. So it's working well.
I'm very impressed you can teach children how to share. I'm not sure I've ever mastered that with the six of mine. I think that's one of the hardest skills, but I think what you're doing is so important, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much
for coming on today. Now, finally, ladies and gentlemen, some good news from the art world. A breath of fresh air amidst the prevailing currents of wokeism. Later this week, the National Portrait Gallery, after its £41 million makeover, will open its Tracy Emin bronze doors and present an exhibition that could be hailed as an antidote to wokeism. Now, I must declare an interest. I was briefly an ex officio trustee as part of my job as Lord President of the Council. But when I was there, I was really impressed by how the trustees and the director worked together to make sure that this project, closing the gallery, could come back on time and on budget. And that's actually happened. It's been a management success as well as a success about enjoying our history rather than being apologetic about it, but also managing to do something that wasn't out of date, wasn't antiquarian. An excellent chairman, David Ross, and they seem to have managed to get it to work. I strongly encourage you to go. It has the great virtue of being free. So visit the National Portrait Gallery when you can and look at the great heroes from our history and make your own judgments of how our history works. That's all from me. Up next, it's Professor Daniel Wootton. Dan, will you be going to the National Portrait Gallery?
Well, I will after that, Sal. It sounds absolutely excellent. I have been before and I will give it another visit. Big show tonight, Sharon Davies here on the battle for women in sport, plus Lee Anderson, Angela Levin and Jim Davidson.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant. You get such exciting people on. Everyone wants to listen to that. After the weather, I'll be back tomorrow night at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and I'm sure it's sunny in Somerset.
Hello, it's Aidan McGibbon here with the GB News forecast from the Met Office. A change on the way over the next few days, fewer showers and sunny conditions for many. It will turn hotter in the south later, but there'll be some persistent rain in the north by the weekend as well. Nevertheless, showers on Wednesday soon disappearing into the night and then clear spells by the time we wake up on Thursday. There'll always some patchy cloud out there and temperatures won't fall much further than 13 to 15 Celsius in the south, perhaps the single figures in the north. A fresher feel compared to the start of the week and compared to what's to come heading into the weekend with some muggy nights returning. But plenty of sunshine first thing on Thursday. As the temperatures rise, we'll see the shower clouds bubble up once again. Again, these will be hit and miss downpours, some thunderstorms out there as well, and most likely affecting northern England into the Midlands, Wales and East Anglia. Away from these, any showers will be fairly isolated. Temperatures hitting 29 Celsius in the southeast, low to mid-20s fairly widely across the UK. And into Thursday night, we keep that muggy feel. In fact, it's a warmer night to come across the UK, despite plenty of clear skies out there. The clouds will build in the west by the end of the night with some showery rain for Northern Ireland. And in many places, temperatures holding up in the mid-teens and perhaps for somewhere like London, 18 Celsius. So we start off Friday with those outbreaks of rain pushing into western Scotland and Northern Ireland. Showery rain, but some heavy bursts as well. For England and Wales, it's largely dry at first with some sunshine, but parts of Wales will see some showers move in by the afternoon. All this associated with a series of weather fronts which are increasingly affecting the north and northwest of the UK into the weekend. They're going to slide across northwestern parts with high pressure clinging close to the south, and that means that there'll be plenty of sunshine for southern and southeastern parts, and those temperatures will really shoot up to 30 Celsius.
First and foremost, I am a GB News fan, and I was before I was working here. Just love the fact that we're asking the questions that a lot of establishment media won't ask.
With a bit of a twist, we not only want to inform you, but we want to keep you entertained.
It's worth the drive because you get in and the team's all ready and waiting, they're itching to go, and it's a proper little family.
GB News is the People's Channel.
It's the audience that makes the programme sing.
We're giving our viewers and our listeners a voice. I see the thousands of your letters, tweets, emails, you name it, coming in.
Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it?
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent you.
It's time for something different. It's time for GB News. I'm very patriotic. I believe in Britain. Our best days lie ahead.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Join us here on GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my two comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Nightmare commute? Kick it up a gear with me, Patrick Christie's, at drive time, 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News Radio. You can listen online and on DAB+, on the smart speaker app, and on the GB News app. And if you've got an Alexa, all you have to say is, Alexa, play GB News. We're also on TuneIn and the Radio Player apps. From the school run to rush hour, get revved up with me, Patrick Christys, on GB News and GB News Radio.
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
No spin, no bias, no censorship. I'm Dan Wootton, and breaking tonight, just 13 hours of oxygen is believed to be left for the missing Titanic submarine. But in an update given in the last few hours, the US Coast Guard made clear that all hope is not lost.
You're in the middle of a search and rescue case, you always have hope. That's why we're doing what we do.
But as a British man reveals he pulled out of going on the doomed vessel over fears its operators were, quote, cutting corners, is this tragic tale something that ultimately should have been avoided, and should the company's allegedly cavalier bosses face a legal probe? That's the subject of my digest next. Then I'll get the thoughts of my superstar panel, and tonight I'm joined by Christine Hamilton, Adam Brooks and Matthew Larzer. Meanwhile, Rye College, the school at the centre of the cat ID row, is facing an investigation by the government, just as the Daily Telegraph reports that teaching assistants elsewhere are taking children who identify as horses out cantering and feeding strips of meat to those who consider themselves to be dinosaurs. This is not a spoof, folks. This is real life. So, as gender madness infiltrates classrooms across the UK, Deputy Tory Chairman Lee Anderson provides us with a much-needed dose of the real world. Also tonight, British Olympian Sharon Davies has been a leading light in the fight to protect women's sport from gender extremism. And in her brilliant new book, Unfair Play, Sharon unmasks the sinister forces spreading this anti-woman ideology across the globe, something she calls the gender industry. We'll discuss her bombshell new analysis, Leah Thomas, Dylan Mulvaney, and much more. On the show last night, Meghan Markle's biographer Tom Bower made this astonishing revelation.
Meghan decided that her real object in life was to be Diana. That has always been her passion. And Meghan went to the extent of suggesting that they should drop the name Windsor and take the surname Spencer.
So should the Sussexes keep the Windsor name or change to Spencer? I want to hear your views, but before that, Petronella Wyatt and Amy Ansell go head-to-head in the clash. And after they lost their $20 million Spotify deal and were labelled effing grifters, will the vengeful pair go back to earning their coin by doing the only thing they know how, slamming the royal family? Harry's biographer Angela Levin gives her expert insight live in the studio shortly. And after Gino D'Acampo sent this morning into meltdown yesterday,
a bit strange because I was going to make melanzane alla parmigiana. Yeah, you know, I love that.
That's one of my
the baked
favourites.
aubergine, but apparently I can't do anything with aubergine at the moment. So I'm going to make a tiramisu.
So instead of gritting her teeth, should Holly Willoughby have confronted the Schofield scandal head-on? Comedy legend Jim Davidson answers that and offers his unique take on the rest of the week's headlines. That's uncancelled. We'll have a first look at tomorrow's newspapers as they drop, and a new Greatest Britain Union jackass too. This is Dan Wootton tonight. Let's go. You're watching GB News, Britain's news channel. Breaking news as it develops on the Titanic sub-drama. First, though, the headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Thanks, Dan. Well, the latest we have on that Titanic sub-drama is that the US Coast Guard said in a news conference just a couple of hours ago that they are now expanding the search area where signals thought to sound out SOS were detected as they raced to locate the missing tourist submersible that tried to visit the Titanic shipwreck. At a news conference this evening, we heard that 5 surface assets are currently working together. There are also 2 remotely operated vehicles currently deployed in the North Atlantic. Officials did say, however, they don't really know what the detected sound signals might be or if they even originated from the Titan. That's the name of the submersible. Well, audiologists from the US Navy are now analysing those recordings. 5 people are inside the craft. They have as little as 20 hours oxygen left and limited rations on board. Captain Jamie Frederick from the US Coast Guard said rescuers have to remain optimistic.
The surface search is now approximately 2 times the size of Connecticut, and the subsurface search is up to 2.5 miles deep, exponentially expanding the size of the search area. We also have to factor in the ever-changing weather conditions, currents, and sea states that expand the search area every hour. There is an enormous complexity associated with this case due to the location being so far offshore, and the coordination between multiple agencies and nations.
Keeping tabs on that story throughout the rest of the evening. Now, news here at home. And a man has been arrested following what one witness described as a mad rampage with a pickaxe at Central Middlesex Hospital in West London. 2 people sustained injuries, with 1 left in life-threatening condition. The suspect has been admitted to hospital with severe injuries described as being self-inflicted. Armed police were deployed to the scene, but the incident wasn't being treated as terror-related. Gareth Brown saw the attacker who chased the 2 men.
We just see him come running out the side of the building with a pickaxe in his hand, chasing two people, which we thought were 2 lads that done something incriminating inside the hospital. Hence, that's why he was chasing them. So that's why we have approached him to make sure he was okay. But that time he's come towards us, swinging his axe, and he's just told us it's none of our business, get out of our way.
The UK's inflation rate stayed the same despite expectations that it might fall. The Office for National Statistics released its figures showing inflation stayed at 8.7% up until May. That's the same rate as during April, and that comes as the UK's net debt reached £2.6 trillion at the end of May, and the average UK house price increased by 3.5% in the 12 months to April. Now, the government has set out a major package of financial support for Ukraine to bolster the country's economic stability as it continues to push back against Russian forces. The package includes a £20 million boost to insure companies working in Ukraine, and the funding, which includes £2.35 billion